My name is Mara Jennings, and 33 years of living had taught me that the corporate world was a battlefield disguised as a polished conference room. What I hadn't expected was that my own sword would be turned against me by the very person who was supposed to wield it alongside me. The fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor cast everything in that sickly white glow that made even the healthiest faces look cadaverous. I sat in my ergonomic chair, fingers drumming against the mahogany conference table, watching Nathan Caldwell shuffle through his notes with the nervous energy of a man who knew he was about to destroy someone's career. Before we discuss Q3 projections, Nathan began, his voice carrying that particular brand of corporate authority that comes from years of kissing up and kicking down, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical force pressing down on my shoulders. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but sweat still beaded along my hairline. Mara Jennings, Nathan continued, his words cutting through the silence like a blade, you are quite simply the biggest failure this company has ever seen. The words hung in the air like toxic gas. I watched as my colleagues' faces shifted from professional neutrality to barely concealed delight. Some tried to hide their smirks behind coffee cups. Others didn't bother trying. But what Nathan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 6 months collecting evidence. The manila folder in my briefcase contained enough documentation to bring down not just Nathan, but the entire corrupt network that had been bleeding this company dry for years. I had learned to be patient. I had learned to be silent. Most importantly, I had learned to be invisible while I gathered the rope they would eventually hang themselves with. The story really began 2 years ago, when I was still the golden child of Vanguard Vertex Solutions. Back then, I reported directly to Judith Malone, the Vice President of Strategic Development, and the closest thing to a mentor I'd ever had in this concrete jungle of corporate ambition. Judith was everything I've aspired to be, brilliant, decisive, and utterly uncompromising when it came to excellence. She had built her department from the ground up, transforming it from a glorified think tank into the strategic powerhouse that drove the company's most successful initiatives. You have the mind of a chess player, she told me once, during one of our late-night strategy sessions. You see 10 moves ahead, while everyone else is still figuring out which piece to move first. Under her guidance, I had developed the cost optimization strategy that saved the company $5 million in operational expenses. I had spearheaded the market expansion initiative that opened up 3 new territories. I had been the architect of the digital transformation blueprint that positioned us ahead of our competitors. The board is taking notice, Judith had said, her eyes twinkling with pride. They're starting to see what I've known all along, that you have the light of a born leader. But corporate fairy tales, I learned, always end with someone getting eaten by the wolf. Judith's diagnosis came without warning: aggressive pancreatic cancer, stage 4. She was given 6 months. She chose to spend them with her family rather than in conference rooms and corner offices. I'm recommending you for the interim position, she told me during her final week. The board will make the official decision, but you're the logical choice. The logical choice. How naive we both were. Nathan Caldwell arrived from the Fairmont office like a virus in an expensive suit. He had never managed a team larger than 12 people, had never handled a budget exceeding $2 million, and had never developed a strategy more complex than deciding which restaurant to choose for client dinners. But he had 2 things I didn't: a Y chromosome and a talent for making mediocrity sound like genius. His first act was to call a department meeting. I arrived expecting to discuss transition plans and current projects. Instead, I found myself listening to Nathan present my cost optimization strategy to the team as if it were his own brilliant conception. This innovative approach to supply chain management, he said, clicking through slides that I had created, will revolutionize our operational efficiency. I sat in stunned silence as he fielded questions about methodologies I had developed, timelines I had established, and metrics I had defined. When someone asked about implementation challenges, he gave the exact answer I had provided in my original presentation to Judith, down to the specific vendor recommendations. After the meeting, I approached him privately. "Nathan, I think there was some confusion during your presentation. That cost optimization strategy was actually my project. I developed it over the past 8 months." He looked at me with the kind of condescending smile that made my skin crawl. "Mara, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I need you to understand something. This department is my responsibility now. All projects, past and present, fall under my purview. I'm sure you contributed to the research, but the strategic vision came from leadership. I have documentation showing, I'm sure you do, but documentation can be interpreted many ways. What matters is results, and results come from leadership. That's what I provide." That was the moment I realized I was no longer playing chess. I was playing warfare. Nathan's strategy became clear over the following weeks. He would systematically undermine my credibility while taking credit for my work. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. First, he restructured the department, removing me from client-facing roles and relegating me to analytical support. Then, he began excluding me from strategic planning sessions while still requiring me to do the research and preliminary work. "I need you to put together a comprehensive analysis of our Southeast expansion opportunities," he would say. "Full market research, competitive analysis, risk assessment. I'll need it by Friday." I would spend the week diving deep into demographics, regulatory environments, and market dynamics. I would compile detailed reports with actionable recommendations and supporting data. Then Nathan would take my work, reformat it with his name on the cover, and present it to senior leadership as his own strategic initiative. When the Southeast expansion was approved for a $20 million budget, Nathan received a commendation from the board. My name never appeared in any of the documentation, but I was learning, I was adapting. Most importantly, I was documenting everything. I began keeping detailed records of every assignment, every meeting, every conversation. I printed emails before they could be deleted. I saved draft versions of reports that showed my authorship. I even began discreetly recording meetings on my phone, taking advantage of the single-party consent laws in our state. The pattern became predictable. Nathan would assign me a project. I would develop the strategy. He would present it as his own work, and I would be relegated further to the background. Each cycle made me more invisible, which, ironically, made me more dangerous. My colleagues began treating me with the mixture of pity and discomfort reserved for the walking wounded. They knew what was happening, but corporate self-preservation trumped moral obligation every time. No one wanted to be seen as disloyal to the new leadership. "You should probably start looking for opportunities elsewhere," my friend Jessica whispered to me one day in the break room. "This isn't going to get better." She was right, of course, but she didn't understand that I wasn't planning to leave. I was planning to stay and watch Nathan destroy himself. The opportunity came when I learned about Edmund Blake's open door policy. As Senior Vice President of Operations, Edmund was known for his willingness to hear ideas from anyone in the organization, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. I began scheduling brief meetings with him, ostensibly to discuss sustainable development initiatives that aligned with his known interests in environmental responsibility and long-term strategic planning. "I've been developing some ideas for reducing our carbon footprint while improving operational efficiency," I told him during our first meeting. "I know it's not exactly my area, but I believe these concepts could have significant impact." Edmund was intrigued. He was also intelligent enough to recognize genuine innovation when he saw it. Over the course of several weeks, I presented him with carefully crafted proposals that showcased my actual strategic thinking abilities. What made this approach particularly effective was that I was presenting ideas that Nathan had never seen. While he was busy stealing and repackaging my past work, I was creating new strategies that he couldn't claim as his own. Edmund began to take notice. More importantly, he began to ask questions. This market penetration strategy is remarkably similar to the Southeast expansion proposal that Nathan presented last month. He mentioned during one of our meetings. Are you two collaborating on these initiatives? Not exactly, I replied carefully. I've been developing these concepts independently. If there are similarities, it might be because we're both drawing from the same market research. Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't a stupid man, and he was beginning to see the pattern. I decided to accelerate my timeline. I began deliberately feeding Nathan flawed strategies, carefully crafted to look promising on the surface, but fundamentally unsound upon closer examination. The first was a proposal for expanding into the Pacific Northwest market. On paper, it looked like a natural extension of our current operations. In reality, it ignored critical regulatory hurdles and competitive disadvantages that would make the expansion prohibitively expensive. Nathan, predictably, took the proposal and presented it to the board as his own groundbreaking strategy. I watched from the back of the room as he fielded questions he couldn't answer about market dynamics he didn't understand. The regulatory environment seems particularly challenging, one board member noted. How do you plan to address the compliance costs? Nathan stammered through a non-answer that made it clear he hadn't done the necessary research. The proposal was tabled for further development. But I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. My deeper investigation into Nathan's activities revealed something far more sinister than simple credit stealing. He had been systematically manipulating performance reviews, budget allocations, and project assignments to benefit his allies, while punishing anyone who might pose a threat to his position. The smoking gun came in the form of email exchanges between Nathan and Colin Reese, the head of human resources. I had always wondered how Colin had managed to survive 3 different leadership changes despite his obvious incompetence. Now I knew. Colin had been accepting consulting fees from Nathan in exchange for manipulating employee records, suppressing discrimination complaints, and ensuring that performance reviews aligned with Nathan's agenda rather than actual job performance. The emails were damning. They discussed specific employees by name, outlining strategies for creating paper trails that would justify terminations or demotions. They talked about budget manipulations that redirected funds from legitimate projects to Nathan's pet initiatives. Most damning of all, they revealed that my own performance reviews had been systematically altered to create a false narrative of declining productivity and poor judgment. I had my smoking gun. Now I needed the perfect moment to fire it. The quarterly meeting was Nathan's idea. He had decided that public humiliation would be the most effective way to force my resignation. He planned to present a devastating review of my failures in front of the entire department, making it impossible for me to continue working there. What he didn't know was that I had prepared for this moment for months. I had copies of everything. The original documents that proved my authorship of the strategies he had claimed, the recordings that showed his pattern of plagiarism, the emails that revealed his conspiracy with Colin. I arrived at the meeting early, my laptop bag containing 2 USB drives with complete documentation of Nathan's crimes. I had also sent encrypted copies to my personal email account and stored backups in a safety deposit box. Nathan began his presentation exactly as I had expected. He outlined my supposed failures with theatrical precision, painting me as a liability that the company could no longer afford to carry. The evidence is overwhelming, he concluded. Mara has consistently failed to meet expectations, has shown poor judgment in strategic planning, and has demonstrated an inability to work collaboratively with the team. The room was silent. I could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes waiting for my response. Some looked sympathetic, others merely curious, but all of them expected me to crumble under the assault. Instead, I stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. "May I respond?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Nathan looked startled. This wasn't part of his script. "I think we've covered everything that needs to be discussed." "Actually," a voice from the back of the room interrupted, "I think we should hear what Mara has to say." Edmund Blake stepped into the conference room, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. As senior vice president, he outranked everyone in the room, including Nathan. "I've been following this situation with great interest," Edmund continued, taking a seat at the head of the table. "Please, Mara, share your perspective." I connected my laptop to the projection system and opened my first presentation. The title slide read, "Strategic Authorship and Intellectual Property, a Case Study in Corporate Plagiarism." The room erupted in whispers. Nathan's face went pale. "Over the past 18 months," I began, "I have developed and implemented 7 major strategic initiatives that have generated over $30 million in revenue and cost savings for this company." I clicked to the next slide, which showed a side-by-side comparison of my original strategy documents and Nathan's presentations. The similarities were undeniable. Each of these initiatives was presented to senior leadership under Nathan Caldwell's name, despite being developed entirely by me. I have documentation showing the creation dates, revision histories, and email chains that prove authorship. I moved through the evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case. I showed the recordings of Nathan explicitly taking credit for my work. I displayed the email exchanges where he discussed his strategy for marginalizing me. I revealed the financial benefits that had accrued to him through promotions and bonuses based on my stolen intellectual property. The room had gone completely silent. Nathan sat frozen in his chair, his carefully constructed facade crumbling with each piece of evidence. But I wasn't finished. "The intellectual property theft, while serious, is only part of the story," I continued. "I've also uncovered evidence of systematic corruption within our human resources department." I displayed the email exchanges between Nathan and Colin, showing their conspiracy to manipulate employee records and suppress legitimate complaints. I showed the financial payments that Colin had received in exchange for his cooperation. This corruption has affected not just my own career, but the careers of dozens of employees who have been systematically discriminated against, demoted, or terminated to protect Nathan's position. Colin Reese had gone from looking merely uncomfortable to appearing physically ill. He kept glancing toward the exit, as if calculating whether he could make it to the door before security arrived. Edmund Blake's expression had shifted from professional interest to barely controlled fury. He was looking at Nathan with the kind of contempt usually reserved for war criminals. "Nathan," Edmund said quietly, "do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around the room desperately, as if hoping someone would come to his defense. No one did. "I think," Edmund continued, "that we need to have a private conversation. Nathan, Colin, please come with me. Everyone else, please consider this meeting adjourned." The room emptied quickly, leaving me alone with my laptop and the scattered remains of Nathan's reputation. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a deep sense of relief that the truth had finally been revealed. As I packed up my materials, Jessica approached me cautiously. "Mara, I'm sorry. We all knew something wasn't right, but we didn't know what to do." "I understand," I replied. "The system is designed to protect people like Nathan. Sometimes you have to work within that system to change it." Over the following days, the full extent of the corruption became clear. Nathan was terminated immediately, his severance package voided due to breach of contract. Colin was also fired, and the company launched an internal investigation into the human resources department. Several employees who had been unfairly treated received retroactive promotions and compensation. 3 discrimination lawsuits that had been buried were reopened and settled favorably for the plaintiffs. Edmund Blake called me to his office a week after the meeting. "The board has asked me to offer you Nathan's position," he said. "Given your obvious qualifications and the circumstances of his departure, it seems like the appropriate response." I considered the offer carefully. The position would restore my career trajectory and provide the platform I needed to implement the changes I had envisioned. But it would also mean staying in an organization that had allowed the corruption to flourish for so long. "I appreciate the offer," I said finally, "but I need some time to think about it." "Of course, take all the time you need. The position will be here when you're ready." As I left his office, I realized that the victory felt different than I had expected. I had spent months planning Nathan's downfall, but now that it had happened, I felt strangely empty. The truth was that Nathan had been a symptom, not the disease. The real problem was a corporate culture that rewarded political maneuvering over actual performance, that protected incompetent leaders while sacrificing talented contributors. I walked through the corridors of the 42nd floor, past the offices and cubicles where my colleagues continued their daily routines. Some smiled at me now, offering congratulations or support. Others avoided eye contact, perhaps wondering what secrets I might know about their own compromises and betrayals. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, watching the numbers count down as I descended toward the lobby. Through the glass walls, I could see the city sprawling out below, filled with countless other office buildings, where countless other Nathan Caldwells were probably stealing credit from countless other Mara Jenningses. But that was a battle for another day. Today, I had won something more valuable than a promotion or a salary increase. I had won the right to define my own worth, to control my own narrative, to choose my own future. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened onto the marble lobby with its soaring ceilings and abstract art installations. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. As I reached the revolving door, I looked back one last time at the building that had been my professional home for the past 5 years. Somewhere up there, Nathan was probably clearing out his office, his career in ruins. Colin was likely consulting with lawyers, preparing for the legal battles that lay ahead. They had underestimated me, assuming that silence meant submission, that patience meant weakness. They had forgotten that the most dangerous opponent is often the one who doesn't fight back immediately, who waits and watches and plans. I pushed through the revolving door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. My phone buzzed with a text message from Edmund Blake. "The board meeting is scheduled for next Friday. Hope you'll consider joining us." I smiled and put the phone back in my pocket without responding. The board could wait. The decision could wait. Everything could wait while I figured out what I really wanted to do with the rest of my life. Nathan had tried to destroy me, but instead, he had freed me. By forcing me to fight back, he had reminded me of my own strength. By stealing my work, he had shown me that my ideas were valuable enough to steal. By trying to silence me, he had given me a voice that was louder than ever. I walked down the street toward the subway station, joining the flow of pedestrians heading home after another day in the corporate battlefield. But I was no longer just another casualty of office politics. I was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to disappear. The quarterly meeting that was supposed to bury me had instead become my resurrection. Nathan thought he was delivering a eulogy, but he had actually been introducing the person who would replace him. As I descended into the subway station, I couldn't help but smile. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And this time I would be the one making the rules.